Hello and welcome to Global Order. My name is Ishan Dhar. It is our privilege to be joined for a special three-part series by one of the country's foremost experts on China, Mr. Vijay Gokhale, who is a distinguished former diplomat who has notably served as India's foreign secretary as well as our ambassador to China. Join us for what will arguably be a revealing deep dive and be one step closer to understanding China. Mr. Gokhale, how would you describe China's overarching economic strategy today? There seem to be both optimistic and not very optimistic scenarios for what China's economic future holds. What is your opinion?
Well, let me begin in 1990 because that is an important date. The Cold War had ended. Economics began to dominate the domestic politics of all countries, whether you were communist or democratic. And the Chinese leadership recognized that without delivering the goods to the Chinese people, they would be ousted from power because they could not coast simply on the basis that they had liberated the Chinese people 40 years previously. And therefore, Deng Xiaoping and his two successors began the process of reforming and opening up. And what we saw was a spectacular growth of the Chinese economy. In fact, the World Bank says that in human history, this is perhaps the most rapid pace at which any major economy has grown. And essentially, they registered 9 to 10% consistently for 30 years, such that China's GDP went from less than $500 billion in 1990 to close to $18 trillion today. So, by any stretch of imagination, this is a formidable achievement. It was achieved principally because they allowed economic decision making to be decentralized. They brought competition into the business mix. They diluted the restrictions in terms of labor, in terms of currency, in terms of exports, such that it allowed for freer trade. But one major factor was also the external environment. With the unipolar world in play, all markets were open, all channels of communication and transportation were available, and China made the fullest use of that to become the world's supply chain and the world's largest trading nation. And really, it was this combination of domestic reform and an external environment that grew the Chinese economy to what was roughly a $12 trillion economy by the end of the global financial crisis. Now, of course, the global financial crisis is important to understand where China took a turn. Because after the global financial crisis, the world began to look at China differently. It had suffered deeply. There had been job loss. There had been a retraction or a contraction of the GDP. And while they were grateful to the Chinese economic growth for sustaining overall global growth, but they felt that on balance, the costs that they were paying was much greater than the benefit they were deriving from the Chinese market. And so, what we have seen systematically from 2012 is a contraction in the global markets, greater protectionism, greater tariff barriers, greater regulations, which will make it more difficult for China, but also for other countries to export. And of course, we have seen a manifestation of that on the 5th of November this year with the re-election of President Trump. In fact, one of the big factors underlying his victory is the sense in the American people that they have conceded too much ground economically to others with no concomitant economic benefits. Now, what therefore China had to suddenly do after 2012 and increasingly after COVID, because this phenomenon has been exacerbated by COVID, is to look at how to deal with this enormous export capacity they have, but which they could no longer export in such large numbers because of shrinking markets and rising protectionism. And therefore, essentially, the only way they could do this was to absorb some of it domestically. Now, this is easier said than done because China's strategy over the last 30 years was to encourage exports and to dampen domestic consumption and to fuel the large domestic savings into infrastructure or industrial chains which added to exports. Now to ask the population to suddenly begin consuming is a Herculean task. And therefore, the current policy which the president has defined is the policy of what he calls dual circulation. In other words, a rebalancing which includes both focusing on export markets, which is external circulation, but also building up internal circulation through encouraging domestic consumption. Uh, that it becomes a difficult prospect to do in the current situation when China is also facing a slowing down of its economy. And part of that is understandable because you can't grow at 10% annually if you are an $18 trillion economy. But part of it is also loss of consumer confidence for a number of reasons that we can talk about. So while the strategy is of dual circulation and theoretically it works well because China is still the world's supply chain and therefore exports are bound to take place, and China has 1.4 billion people, so domestic consumption is also possible. In practice, it isn't playing out that way, either in the export markets or domestically. And what we are therefore seeing is an economy certainly in turmoil. I would not call it an economy in crisis, but I would certainly not say it is a healthy economy at this point of time.
Correct. You mentioned loss of consumer confidence. That perhaps seems like an internal challenge facing the economy today. Uh, Could you touch upon that further, and what other internal challenges might there be to
Yes,
implementing the measures that they're trying to go with?
I think that's a very important point. I think we have to understand that through the period from 1990 to 2015, when China was at its most productive and when real incomes were rising each year for the past 25 years, there were very few avenues for the Chinese people to save for future investment. Uh, Putting money in banks was untenable because rates were extremely low through this period. It was not the practice to buy gold. Keeping it in the stock exchanges was relatively tricky because China did not have a history of stock exchanges in the early part of the communist rule, and therefore people were not familiar with it. The obvious destination for savings was property. And the infrastructure boom led to people investing in more than one property because it was almost guaranteed for 30 years that your investment would grow because the economy was growing and people's real incomes were growing. Such that by 2020, it is believed in one study that 70% of all domestic savings were in property. And then you had the property crash because there's just that many buildings you can build and just that many buildings that people can buy, particularly when the demographics are plateauing and are now in a slow decline. And therefore, what happened was just when you wanted domestic people to start consuming and to spend their money, the value of their savings began to go in the reverse direction. And this led to a loss of consumer confidence. There was a sense of anxiety that the savings were depleting, and therefore, or the notional savings were depleting in terms of property, and therefore, would it be wise to spend them? Now, adding to this anxiety was, of course, the negative demographics. And therefore, in people's minds, the view that if I don't save from my old age, I have only one child, and will she or he be able to provide for me because society is shrinking and the number of working adults is shrinking. And it was further made more anxious by the general sense in China that there was a lot of emigration abroad of the better part of the working population, the cleverer part of the population, and that in a sense, the shrinking external environment in terms of protectionism, rising Chinese exports falling, meant that the expected growth rate that they've been led to believe of 5, 6, 8% per annum would be more like 1, 2, or 3% per annum. So this is a very powerful psychological factor which is playing out in China. And while all the statistics might indicate that dual circulation could work because it is a large population and they have a per capita income at least 4 times that of India, and it is an urban population of 70%. These are all parameters which actually encourage consumption. There are psychological as well as real economic factors which are militating against that argument. Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute that therefore China is reaching a crisis point. It is still a formidable economy. But I think that the dual circulation is not working in the way that the government expected it to work. And one very clear indication of this is the massive stimulus package that they introduced in July. You only stimulate an economy if it is sluggish. You are not going to stimulate a healthy economy. So this is a clear sign that they are having to readjust policy and measures, fiscal and monetary measures, because the dual circulation is not working in practice as it was intended to in theory.
And you mentioned President Trump just now and protectionism. He has promised to raise tariffs on Chinese imports, I think, to 60%, as well as impose other restrictions. I think restrictions such as over Chinese ownerships of U.S. assets, etc. Some sources have suggested this is going to perhaps create greater instability in the U.S.-China bilateral. How do you see this playing out? Do you think it will actually generate instability? And if it does, what would the ramifications be?
I think first we must give credit to President Donald Trump for calling this out not now, but in 2016 when he was elected President of the United States. He foresaw that the massive Chinese exports were hollowing out industry in the United States of America. And he called this out when the rest of the world was still, in a sense, enchanted with the Chinese. The Europeans certainly continued to invest in China, continued to believe that the market would yield huge returns for them, and in a sense criticized Donald Trump for calling out the Chinese. And that was true of many countries in the global south as well. The fact of the matter, however, was that President Donald Trump had put his finger on the nub of the problem, which was that an $18 trillion economy cannot just export its way out of trouble without causing trouble for the rest of the world. And that trouble is now manifesting itself in very real ways. For instance, in the electric vehicle sector, many studies suggest that China is producing more electric vehicles, even more than the global demand. And that as a result of this overproduction or this glut of EVs, the global price of EVs is falling such that other non-Chinese EV companies are unable to compete. The same is true of solar photovoltaic cells. In that sector, China produces so many SPVs that the rest of the world simply cannot compete. Now, in the long run, this is not just not good for the rest of the world because, in a sense, we are dependent on a single source, but it is bad for China because what it engages in is a price war, and that undercutting has reached a point to which even Chinese factories now find it difficult to maintain full production. Layoffs are happening, closures are happening, uh, uh, loans are being defaulted upon, and at the end, that is going to have social and economic ramifications in China. So, in a sense, Donald Trump has recognized that this is the problem well before everybody else. Perhaps in his first term, he didn't handle it very well because he was new to government. I suspect that this time he has not only greater experience, but more international support, including from us. Because we too, in the last 5 or 6 years, have seen the impact of what Chinese exports have done to our own industry. To give just one example, the pharmaceutical industry, which is one of India's star performers, is so dependent now on Chinese manufactured active pharmaceutical ingredients that if, for instance, China were to theoretically turn off the tap tomorrow, your export sector would be deeply affected. We surely do not want that situation to transpire. I presume neither does Mr. Donald Trump. So, what we are going to see is a significant trade friction between China and the United States. The Chinese expect it, they are preparing for it, they have retaliatory tools. We should not imagine this is a one sided contest. In a number of sectors, China can also tighten the screws on the United States. But I think the rest of the world is also going to be having a bumpy ride as a result. And we have to see how the policies unfold after the 20th of January.
Why don't we play that situation out hypothetically? You mentioned retaliatory tools and measures. What could those be, or what are they likely to be?
Well, I think there are certain vulnerabilities that the international economy, or shall I say the Western economies, face. One, of course, is in the EV sector. Almost all batteries are produced in China or by Chinese companies, and most of the world's lithium and cobalt reserves are controlled by them, along with a lot of other critical minerals for the electronic sector. And in a sense, if China exercises its trump card, it can paralyze the global auto industry, which also has implications, by the way, for climate change, because countries cannot keep their climate change goals if EVs, which is one of the core factors in replacing the internal combustion engine, if that model goes bust. Similarly, for instance, China has a lot of controls on rare earths, which I brought out on. Some of the key machinery is now only made in China. 90% of the world's containers are Chinese made. A very large percentage of the world's cranes, which are used in infrastructure building and ports, are made in China. Large tunnel boring machines used for building tunnels in mountains or digging metro tunnels are made in China. You would have perhaps seen a clip which went viral a few days ago, where the Indian Commerce Minister was telling his German counterpart that a German company making these massive boring machines in China could not export them to India, allegedly because of some customs problem. Now, I would be willing to hazard the guess that this is more than a mere customs problem. This is, in a sense, a sanction on India, in a demonstration that if you are going to limit Chinese investment, I also have certain economic tools at hand. So many of these tools are available in terms of supply chain, in terms of certain key leading technologies, in terms of the way in which they've built their own reputation in the global south to the disadvantage of the West, which can and I suspect might be deployed if trade wars between the United States and China escalate beyond a point. But I do also want to add the cautionary note, Ishan, that these two economies are so heavily intertwined,
Right.
not only in terms of supply chains, but financially as well, with the Chinese investing heavily in US treasury bills and the US dollar being key, that there are certain limits within which this trade war is likely to play out. It cannot be an all out war because that will not only devastate both economies but the rest of the global economy as well. So let's see what policies President Trump rolls out after the 20th of January. That will determine the Chinese response.
Correct. And here in India, of course, we've been watching the Belt and Road Initiative very closely. All these years into it now, how far would you say it has come to achieving both its economic and, I suppose, strategic objectives, which are, of course, heavily intertwined?
Yeah, so that's the point. Let me begin with that point. This is
Mm.
not just an economic initiative, although China claims it is. It
Right.
is a geostrategic initiative as well. What the Chinese are doing is building an alternative hub and spokes trading system, so that its dependency on the West in terms of trade and markets reduces over time. And we must give credit to our government, which was the first one to point this out. Essentially, India never supported the Belt and Road Initiative on a simple argument. The argument was that Indian companies had, over the last 70 or 75 years, adjusted to a certain standard of doing business, certain technology standards, certain specifications, certain customs procedures, certain phytosanitary requirements, such that we were now truly competitive globally. And this was the time the Indian economy would grow because we could compete with the West. All of a sudden, a new player comes and tries to build a different set of standards, specifications, technology requirements, phytosanitary procedures, quarantine procedures, with which we were unfamiliar in large parts of the global south. Because the Belt and Road Initiative is not just infrastructure building, it is also building the soft frameworks in these countries, customs regulations, for instance, controls on agricultural and animal export and import through phytosanitary restrictions, control on the way in which medicines or chemicals are exported or imported by setting certain standards, setting standards for such advanced technologies as high speed rail or high speed internet or 5G mobile communication. And the objective, of course, is to give a disproportionate advantage to Chinese companies and to disadvantage others. So I think the Belt and Road Initiative has been correctly identified by India as something which is disruptive and which India needs to build, to be cautious about. Now, as far as the Belt and Road Initiative itself is concerned, I think we should not buy the Western argument that it is a failure. It is, in fact, in very substantial measure, a success, simply because a lot of the smaller countries find that China is an alternative to Western financing and technology, which came with a lot of preconditions, including environmental preconditions, labor standards, social requirements, all these political requirements, which had nothing really to do with the project at hand. And many of the countries in the global south or the third world felt that these were unreasonable conditions, but we had nowhere to go. Now, an alternative presents itself in the form of the People's Republic of China. And provided good quality infrastructure can be built, and China certainly has that capability, third world governments are able to go back to the electorate and say they have done the job. Therefore, to presume that because major countries in the world have anxieties about the Belt and Road Initiative, this automatically translates into a global dislike or concern would be barking up the wrong tree. Nonetheless, there are pockets of discontent. For instance, in the case of Pakistan, a lot of the dream that was sold by President Xi Jinping in 2015 has not materialized 9 years later. In parts of Africa, the Chinese companies under the Belt and Road Initiative are seen as predatory, as seeking control over resources or land by making these countries go into a debt, or by controlling their infrastructure in terms of not permitting those countries to exercise full sovereign rights over them. In some cases, because of the Chinese model of taking their equipment and their labor force as well, there is unhappiness in local communities because they have lost out on business or on labor and labor contracting. But all said and done, I do not see any kind of a global opposition or even some kind of a regional opposition, let us say in Africa, to Chinese practices or the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. Now, the question that, however, arises is post-COVID, does China have the capacity to continue financing it on the same grand scale? And two reasons would militate against that. First, of course, is whatever they have already spent is more difficult now to recover because post-COVID, the third world economies are struggling to balance the budget and don't have money to service interest payments, let alone the principal amounts. Secondly, the Chinese economy itself is now slowing down to a more sedate percentage of 3 to 4% GDP growth. And therefore, the resources that they can freely distribute and even possibly write off have shrunk. So we have to see whether they will pivot now to a more sophisticated or less ambitious approach. But BRI is here to stay, and it is a challenge for us. I think India is doing its bit in not necessarily competing with the Chinese in terms of development assistance, but focusing on what is in our economic interest and in the mutual interest of both sides. But nevertheless, I think as we become a major economy, as our exports grow, as our companies go abroad, we will see more and more the challenge that we are getting from the Chinese BRI.
You mentioned that they might pivot to a more sophisticated or less ambitious approach, at least when it comes to this kind of integration. What might that look like, if there is any?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, of course, scaling down on the big projects.
Right.
Projects which cost in the billions of dollars, which were basically dams or huge infrastructure, they would cut down on that. Secondly, their objective is to export new technologies. Those are the sunrise industries. So, for example, they would focus on exporting high speed rail. And there is a massive push under BRI to export high speed rail. They would push on exporting electric vehicles. They would push on exporting renewable energy solutions, whether it is solar, whether it is wind, whether it is geothermal or nuclear. Because those are areas where China sees a 50-year horizon and its technology is world class. So they would go for such areas. And thirdly, they would go for digital areas. Though that is where in the services sector they need to dominate, which is why 5G, 6G rollouts in these countries is of high priority. Because once you control the network, you basically can control digital services and then provide them as China moves up the value chain from manufacturing into the services sector. So these are really the changing priorities. Now, of course, it does cost less if you go into the services sector as compared to hard infrastructure, but it doesn't eliminate large spending because if you want to build high-speed rail, that's an expensive proposition. So I think it is a sort of pivot that is taking place, but it undoubtedly is responding to the domestic fiscal situation and the global ability of the world to pay them back.
Mr. Gokhale, that was most insightful. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Ishan.
Just,